Water-soluble graphite pencils might look like traditional drawing pencils, but they have graphite in their cores that can be activated with water. This means that just like when we're working with watercolor pencils, for example, we apply that material on the paper, and then we can bring in a paintbrush and a little bit of water, run those paintbrush bristles over that material, and it'll activate, it'll dissolve, and you'll be left with more of a painterly effect. And I had wanted to try water-soluble graphite pencils for quite some time for a few different reasons. The first one being that I really enjoy watercolor pencils, and I do have many watercolor pencil tutorials on my channel. I'll make sure to link to just a few of them down below. Second being that I also like creating drawings with traditional graphite pencils, but I noticed that when people used water-soluble graphite, they were able to create a wider range of values. They were able to develop darker values than what traditional graphite pencils allowed. See, graphite pencils only allow you to get so dark. You're going to be able to get pretty dark, but it's going to end up looking like a dark gray. Whereas when you're using water-soluble graphite, especially graphite that has been laid down with softer pencil grades like a 6B or an 8B, and you activate that graphite, it ends up looking black, so you can get that full range of values. And another thing that I wanted to explore about water-soluble graphite is this huge advantage that it offers, which is filling in large areas faster. If you've ever done shading in large areas with traditional graphite pencils, you already know how time-consuming that can be. And when it comes to using water-soluble graphite, you can fill in areas a lot faster because you're activating that graphite with water and a paintbrush. But you should know that different formats of water-soluble graphite are available, such as sticks and also powder. So you can get an idea of how easy it would be to fill in larger areas with powder, for example. In this video, I'm going to be sharing my process for my first ever drawing that I have created with water-soluble graphite. I'm also going to be sharing my key findings with you and also my main tips that will help you arrive at better results. All right, so let's jump right into tip number 1. And this one is going to be to know your pencil grades. Different drawing pencil grades have graphite in their core, which is harder or softer. You're going to notice that these pencils have a little code on them, which is a letter and a number, 2 letters, or a letter on its own. H stands for hard, B stands for bold or black, and the higher the number is, the softer or harder that graphite is. The HB pencil is right in between hard and soft pencil grades. You can see it as the middle of the range pencil. And if you ever see an F pencil, F stands for fine. It is quite similar to the HB and only slightly harder. Always have in mind that the harder the graphite, the scratchier the tip is likely to be. And also the tip is going to take longer to become blunt. And this is very important because harder graphite pencils will allow us to create cleaner, lighter looking lines, while softer pencil grades are great for developing darker values, higher levels of contrast, and it also allows us to fill in large areas faster because that graphite is softer. It's easier to blend and blur out. So by knowing this, we can strategically choose the different pencil grades that are going to be optimal for different parts of the drawing process. We usually want to start our drawing nice and light so that we can easily erase mistakes. And after shapes and proportions, perspective, all of that is looking good, we can move on to shading and bringing in softer and softer pencil grades. As a general rule of thumb, when I am drawing, I usually make my way from lights to darks gradually. This doesn't mean I can't go back to a previous harder pencil grade if I need to, but this provides an overall strategy that I can keep coming back to in order to have more control throughout the process, which is going to lead to better results. This water-soluble graphite pencil set from Faber-Castell that I bought includes an HB pencil, a 2B, a 4B, a 6B, and an 8B. So the hardest pencil grade in this set is the HB pencil. The softest pencil grade in this set is the 8B pencil. I'm testing out these 5 different pencil grades and just seeing how this graphite activates with water because I've never used water-soluble graphite pencils before. I have used watercolor pencils before though, and I expect them to work quite similarly. Graphite from my HB pencil is at the top. You can see how it's the lightest. And I make my way gradually toward my softest pencil grade, so that 8B pencil is at the bottom. The application felt very similar to me as when I am using traditional graphite pencils. And the finish, as well as the difference between these pencil grades, also looks quite similar to when I am doing this with traditional graphite pencils. When I activated the graphite with water and a paintbrush, things became a little bit more intense, which was very interesting to see. Moving on to tip number 2, and this one is to use paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums, such as watercolor paper. For this rose study, I'm going to be using hot press watercolor paper from Arches. I thought that hot press watercolor paper would be good for this study because it's the least textured type of watercolor paper out there. It's the smoothest. When I am bringing in drawing mediums such as watercolor pencils or pen and ink, anything like that, which has a sharp tip to it, I make sure to think of the paper that I am using and more specifically its texture, because that tip is going to be skipping over that tooth. And it's totally fine if you're okay with broken lines, but in this particular case, I am practicing my shading and I'm going for a bit of a higher level of realism, so I thought a smoother surface would be best. Using thicker paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums is even more important if you're thinking of bringing in a good amount of water to do your activation, and also if you're going to be working in several different layers. If you're going to be bringing in just a small amount of water and you're only going to be working in 1 or 2 layers, you could get away with working on thick bristle board. It all depends on the techniques that you're thinking of bringing in and the finish that you're going for. Moving on to tip number 3, and this one is to develop your water control. Something that I always have on hand when I am working with watercolor pencils, for example, is my absorbent towel, which I use when I am painting with traditional watercolor paint as well. And you're going to notice that I have that right beside me and that I'm constantly dabbing the tip of my brush on my absorbent towel once I have started activating my graphite. When we're using water-soluble graphite pencils, we don't really need too much water, especially when we are painting in or shading in smaller areas or smaller shapes. We only need a small amount of water to do our activation. And if we start bringing out too much water from our container, we can definitely start losing control and arrive at a lot of splotchiness. So when you start activating that graphite with water and a brush, make sure that you don't bring out too much water from your container. Maybe make sure that you're gently scraping those paintbrush bristles along the top of the container to get rid of that excess drippage, and make sure that you have some type of absorbent towel on hand. Also, make sure that you don't continue going over the same area over and over when you're doing your activation, because that can also lead to splotchiness. Moving on to tip number 4, and this one is going to be to plan for your highlight areas and allow more of that paper to shine through in these areas. What I like doing is my brightest highlights are actually just the white paper uncovered by any graphite. Lighter value areas have some amount of graphite in them, especially harder graphite, which looks lighter. And the darker and darker my values get, I use more layering and I bring in softer and softer pencil grades. So in other words, the lighter the value, the more paper is left shining through. The darker the value, the more of that paper is covered up. If we don't plan for our highlights and light value areas, it's very likely that we're going to start making everything too dark, and that is going to make everything look heavy, muddy, flat, and not very realistic, because we need that range of values from lightest lights to midtones to darkest darks if we're looking for believable results. And a huge tip for you if you're just getting started with developing that ability to tell where highlight areas are, where midtone areas are, and where darkest dark areas are in a reference photo or something that you have in front of you in real life, is practice using grayscale or black and white photos. I actually desaturated this photo in my photo editing software, and I was working off that. Working off grayscale or black and white photos simplifies this process and helps you build up these skills, because instead of seeing a photo that is full color, everything is unified or synthesized into one same color scale. You see white for your brightest highlights, you see a range of lighter to darker grays, and you see black for your darkest value. In my opinion, working off grayscale photos is one of the best things that you can do to develop that eye for understanding value or tonal relationships, so that you're then able to recreate those relationships in your drawings or paintings. Getting value or tonal relationships right is what's most important when it comes to developing a believable sense of depth and 3D-ness and light and shadow on a flat two-dimensional surface like a piece of paper or canvas. And another super important tip for you if you're looking for mid to higher levels of realism in your artwork is make sure that you're stemming off great reference photos. High quality photos that are actually going to make the process easier for you. I see so many beginners struggling with their drawings or paintings because they're not using quality photos, and they are making the process a lot harder for themselves, and they're likely not going to arrive at the best results. Not all photos are optimal for drawing or painting purposes. Firstly, you want to make sure that you're using a photo that has a relatively high resolution where you can zoom in and see details. Secondly, you want to make sure that the lighting in the photo is good. How can you tell? You can tell if the lighting in the photo is good if you can see dark areas, you can see light areas, and you can see midtones. You do not want to use over or underexposed photos where everything is way too light and you don't have darks, or where everything is way too dark and you don't have lights, because again, you're not going to be able to see that range of values, and thus you're not going to be able to recreate that wide range of values that you need. And finally, another thing that I always make sure to notice in my photos in order to tell if they are good for art making purposes is if there is any weird cropping situation going on where my object or my subject is being cropped off in a weird way. I want to be able to see everything completely. Tip number 5 is when you're doing your activation, work from light toward dark. This is going to make it so that you keep those highlight areas protected, and it's going to give you more control as you're doing your graphite activation with a paintbrush. See, if you start in the darkest areas where you've already layered a good amount of graphite, what you're going to do is you're going to start pulling that graphite into the lightest areas, covering up that paper and getting rid of those lightest values. Whereas if you start in the light areas and you make your way toward the dark areas, you're not going to be pulling extra graphite into dark areas. And if you do lighten those dark areas by accident, you can always just add more graphite on top and darken them again. It's important to remember that it's always going to be easier to darken something than it is to lighten something. And after you've activated your graphite with water, you're not going to be able to erase it. As I'm doing my activation, I'm constantly observing my reference photo, and I'm making sure that I'm reminding myself of which are the lightest areas that I want to make sure to keep protected and where the darkest areas are. And in flowers, for example, usually darkest areas are those innermost sections of those petals where there is a lot of overlapping taking place and the light is not able to reach those sections of those petals. Whereas lighter areas are sections of petals that are closer to the light. Really practicing our observation skills is key, especially when you're going for higher levels of realism, Make sure that you're constantly observing your reference photo or whatever is in front of you in real life. And also keep in mind the three-dimensional structure of what it is that you're shading and how it is being affected by light. And finally, there is tip number 6. This one is going to be to allow your layers to dry completely before working on the next. There is no correct or incorrect amount of layers to work in. You can work in as many layers as you'd like until you arrive at the results that you enjoy. However, make sure that after you do every single activation with water and a paintbrush, you allow everything to dry completely before working on the next. Always remember that wet paper is fragile paper, even when you're working on paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums. And because we're using sharp, pointy tools, you want to be careful not to damage it or scratch it. Also, if the paper is wet and you start to create lines or marks on it with water-soluble graphite, which you can definitely do, that is a technique. However, if you're going for more realistic shading and you're looking to avoid lines and marks and undesired texture, you can make things way harder for yourself. So don't rush the process, be patient, and you can certainly use a hairdryer if you want to speed up the drying process. Alright you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!